Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What a delight to see so many of you here. It's a pleasure indeed to welcome you to these imposing surroundings here in Glasgow. I was professor of surgery at Glasgow University back in the 1860s. Long before many of you were born, I imagine. Yeah. But of course, I've spent most of my years living, working, teaching, and studying in Edinburgh at the Royal College of Surgeons there. Oh, I do beg your pardon. I haven't even had the good manners to introduce myself. Lister's the name. Joseph Lister. Yes, I cannot be certain how much longer I'll remain in Edinburgh. You see, King's College in London have been making overtures for my services, and I fear I may not be able to refuse them much longer. You see, at long last, my ideas on germ theory and the antiseptic principle are gradually being adopted, both here in Scotland and abroad. But in England, no. No, they still refuse to accept the very real benefits of antiseptic surgery. And surgery, you see, has been my passion. Ever since, as a student in London, I remember I witnessed the great Robert Lister, yes, performing the very first operation conducted under ether. Robert Lister. Oh, there was a man before anesthesia, when speed was absolutely essential to reduce pain and to improve the chances of survival. It's said that Lister could amputate a limb in less than a minute. He was a sight to behold. One account describes him springing across the blood-stained floorboards upon his swooning, sweating patient, strapped down as he was, calling out, "Right, gentlemen, time me," to his students, all agog, looking down from the upper galleries. The first flash of his knife was followed so swiftly by the rasp of saw on bone that sight and sound seemed, to me, as a young student, seemed simultaneous. And to free both his hands, he would clasp the bloody knife between his teeth. Lister's enthusiasm wasn't to everyone's liking. The story goes that he once sawed through a patient's leg, then carried on through the fingers of his assistant, both of whom later died, unfortunately, from hospital gangrene. And in his excitement, he also slashed through the coat of an innocent spectator who dropped dead from fright. It's the only operation in medical history with a 300% mortality rate. And back then, just as when I began practicing, a surgeon, you see, was not required to wash his hands before tending to a patient. And I put my own hands up, my dirty hands, as it were, for I was as guilty as anyone else. I wore an old frock coat for operations that was stiff and glazed with blood. In fact, a blood-spattered surgeon's coat was considered to be a mark of knowledge and experience. What I know now, after all these years, it makes me recoil in horror. What these stories illustrate is the lack of any surgical hygiene at that time. And it is this link to post-operative infection that has become my life's work. Ever since I arrived in Edinburgh more than 24 years ago, under the watchful eye of our finest ever surgeon, Mr. James Syme. I owe everything to him. Yes, Syme took me under his wing. He gave me every opportunity that I could need to progress in the medical world. And just as importantly, he was father to my beautiful wife Agnes, who remains a source of strength and inspiration to me. But I mustn't digress. You see, it was about this time that surgical operations were becoming rather common, due to the use of chloroform as an anesthetic, thanks to a certain James Young Simpson. Now, surgical operations, even under chloroform, were considered a last resort due to the high mortality rate caused by infection in the recovery period. Simpson himself said, "A man laid on the operating table in one of our surgical hospitals is exposed to more chance of death than was the English soldier on the battlefield at Waterloo." And he was right. Just picture, if you will, the surgeon approaches you with his coat caked in the blood of previous patients, his hands stained from an earlier operation. He anesthetizes you with chloroform, then applies the tourniquet, already perhaps infecting the open wound with the germs from his dirty hands and clothes. The instruments, the knife, the saw, the retractor that would be used in the amputation, they may well have been lying in his bag for days without having been cleaned between amputations, and still stained with the blood and the fluids of different patients. The surgeon would then, having completed the task, move on to his next appointment, wearing the same clothes and without considering at all to wash his hands before dealing with the open wound of his next patient. This, for me, had to be where the problem lay. In fact, over 30 years ago, doctors like Oliver Wendell Holmes and Ignaz Semmelweis, they were already arguing the case for improved hygiene to reduce infections. Semmelweis had his doctors wash their hands in calcium chloride. And this was before and after operations. And deaths on his wards, well, they fell from 12% to just 1%. But because they couldn't actually prove that there was a link between hygiene and infection, their views were dismissed as the ramblings of eccentrics. Some said, there is no point in a surgeon being clean. An executioner might as well manicure his fingernails before chopping off a head. Can you imagine that? These doubters, as they were, they all believed that the infections arose spontaneously inside the wound and was due to the patient being exposed to what they called bad air or miasma, and that absolutely nothing could be done about it. It was while I was professor of surgery at Glasgow University that I started to see where the link between hygiene and infection could be made. The great French chemist Louis Pasteur produced a paper addressing the problem of wine going bad due to faulty fermentation. He argued that organisms didn't come to life spontaneously from within the wine, in the manner that our surgeons were suggesting happened with open wounds. He proved it was caused by germs entering the fermentation process from the air. Now, this made immediate sense to me. And so, after conducting my own experiments with urine, I came to similar conclusions as Pasteur. Chance, Pasteur once said, favors the mind which is prepared. I was prepared. And I realized that if germs entering from outside the wound were causing the infection, then there had to be a way of killing the germs before they entered the body. My task was to discover a chemical which might do this job, and I began to experiment with carbonic acid, which I had witnessed being used to rather good effect in treating the sewers of Carlisle, which I must say smelt noticeably more pleasant than did some of the hospital wards in Glasgow. I used this carbolic acid solution to wash my hands, to spray all the instruments, the incisions, the dressings, and to thoroughly clean a wound. And almost immediately, infections were reduced and survival rates, they increased remarkably. My first real success came with an 11-year-old boy by the name of James Greenlees. Poor James, he'd been run over by a cart, leaving him with a terrible compound fracture to his leg. I washed his wound thoroughly with my carbolic acid solution. I then dressed the wound with a kind of carbolic putty. I covered that with tin foil so as to reduce any chance of germs entering the wound. And after just 4 days, when I went to renew the pad, I discovered that no infection had developed. The process was repeated every few days, and to my amazement, after just 6 weeks, young James walked out of that hospital ward on 2 healthy legs. I then developed a machine that I'm sure that you may well be familiar with. It pumped out a fine mist of carbolic acid into the air around an operation. Unfortunately, this wasn't very popular with all the surgeons because they deemed it too large and cumbersome, but it was a small price to pay for its success. Since then, I've had the honour to have been asked to return to Edinburgh to take over Mr. Syme's post at the university where my research has continued. In particular, I've greatly improved the quality of our dressings, and I have replaced my carbolic acid solution with one of boracic acid, thus reducing inflammation. And I continue to experiment in improving the quality of sutures, which themselves can, of course, lead to infection. Silk has long been perceived as the best material, but my experiments with the less pliable but more absorbent catgut soaked in my antiseptic solution, I have to say they are proving most encouraging. But as is often the case with new ideas, professional acceptance has been painfully slow. Many of my colleagues, you see, they have a problem with the whole concept of germ theory. For example, Dr. James Spence, and in particular our own Dr. Bennett, Professor of Physiology, have thrown it back in my face. Where are the germs, Lister? Show them to us and we will believe. Has anyone seen these germs, he would say? And James Morton in Glasgow, he still cannot accept that something so small that can barely be detected under a microscope can have the power to kill a man. He has the audacity, has Morton, to dismiss my work as merely a hobby that has been taken too far, the latest toy of medical science. And as for James Young Simpson, yes, we are indebted to him for his early experimentations with chloroform, of course, but as for his constant, virulent, sniping opposition to me, well, perhaps history in time will judge. Do forgive me for getting carried away, but it does exasperate me so. I mean, if our own Queen Victoria will allow me, as I did, to stick a knife into her sacred body, and then she goes on to praise my great invention, well, what else must I do to satisfy the skeptics? Yes, it's been a long road, and there is still much work to be done. But slowly, my theories have begun to gain acceptance. I've lectured in New York, I've given papers in Philadelphia, in Paris, and at the International Medical Congress in Amsterdam, where the president, Professor Donder, said, "It is not only admiration that we offer you, Professor Lister, it's our gratitude and that of the nations to which we all belong." And if indeed I do make the move to King's College, I'm sure that I can continue to convince my profession of the very real benefits of hygienic surgery. For my endeavors are more important to me than personal prestige, than the selfish cravings of honors and recognition. For me, it has always been, and always will be, about saving lives. Well, you must forgive me. I think I've carried on with my ramblings a little too much. But it has been a pleasure to address you. But my carriage awaits to return me to Agnes in Charlotte Square in the capital, where no doubt we will be back at the microscopes after dinner. I have a fresh batch of frogs that I can't wait to get started on. Thank you, and may good fortune smile on all your future endeavors.